talk by Professor Jonathan Soeharno, full professor of Administration of Justice and Legal Philosophy at the University of Amsterdam, but also a practicing lawyer and deputy judge at the Court of Appeal. He has experience with research integrity issues in many different roles, but also with integrity issues beyond research, involving lawyers, judges, bankers, and a whole lot of other professions. So very interested to hear about his perspectives and combining all of this for us today. Jonathan, please.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation. At the end of the day, I actually wanted to present a question to you. And this is a question that I don't have the answer to. So I'm very curious as to your input and your reactions. And this is a question that we have discussed quite extensively in the last months while we were evaluating the Dutch Code of Research Conduct. So it's also part of the evaluation report. And you'll see in the evaluation report that we struggle with it. And so we're also wondering how this is to be put down in the next Code of Conduct. And the question is basically very simple. Namely, should the academia determine what a right culture is, or should other parties determine that? Now, if we look at the classic, so I'm basically explaining my questions in the next slides. The classic view on science, as you know, from Quine, but if I could have quoted many others. Science is all about saving the phenomenon. What are the facts? How do we know? We don't know what truth is, but we should have a shared pursuit of truth, or a shared desire to pursue the truth, even though we know as a scientific, the truth is a too big word. But we don't have to go into that theoretical discussion. You all know what I mean, I think. And academic freedom, the standard conception, the classic conception, is basically the freedom to pursue the interests of science only. Falsification as a method of scientific progress. So what is progress? Is being able to say, well, I found out that you are not right. And then we have progress. We're doing something good then, as a scientist. You all know how this goes. And also, if we look at the codes of conduct, or the codes of research conduct in the Netherlands, the standard codes, so I think the first official one was 2004, and up until 2014, this was the classic conception. So, and there was a value of honesty, scrupulousness. These values are important because these values are understood to describe what a good research culture looks like. Scientific and scholarly activities should remain unaffected by the pressure to achieve. Communication should be dispassionate and realistic. The ultimate aim of science is to establish facts. Independence, third-party funding, only when the scientist has the idea that this can contribute to academic research. Impartiality, the academic, is led by no other interest than academic interest. And very importantly, academic practitioners are impartial and objective. And they do not let any personal interest, preference, affection, prejudice, etc., affect their judgment or decisions. And lastly, and very importantly, the choice of methods and criteria is made solely to establish the facts. So this is really the classic picture that you'll find, I think, up until that time, also internationally in most research codes. This was the canon, so to say, of what the science looked like. Now, in this audience, you all know that this has changed quite fundamentally. And speaking for the Netherlands, in the the code that we just evaluated, the code of 2018, we see that there is more room now that the academia serves another purpose, an external purpose. For example, by independence, it says that independence is required at all times in the design, the conduct, and in the reporting of research, but not necessarily in the choice of the research topic and, very importantly, the research question. And the driver of this change was the demand from the applied sciences, who said, well, we have so much research that we're doing on behalf of others or within contracts, and so there we do not have independence, but as long as the conduct is sufficiently independent. And responsibility, there it says that that the researcher, among other things, does not operate in isolation, but must take into account, within reasonable limits, the legitimate interests of human and animal test subjects, okay, fine, as well as those of the commissioning parties, funding bodies, and the environment. So here there are external purposes that must be weighed, must be taken into account within reasonable. So we see a very clear shift from, let's say, the classic position to another position where the academia at the core of within the core values is allowed to take into account external purposes. Responsibility also means conducting research that is scientifically and or societally relevant. The and or is very important here. So it's not, so you can do research as a scientist that you do not find scientifically relevant, but you do find societally relevant. So the KNW, the Royal Dutch Academy of Sciences, then 3 years later published a report about academic freedom. And they took this sentence a bit further. And I think it's safe to say, and I know that there's people here who wrote the 2018 Code of Conduct, I think it's safe to say that they brought it a step further and further than the code was intended. Because they said one of the professional standards that may limit and direct academic freedom is the responsibility for people, society, and the environment. Limit and direct. So here you clearly have this sense of purpose that extends beyond the purpose of science only. And then lastly, they say that this practice implies that researchers should practice science that is scientifically and or societally relevant. And this means that scientists should always seek a proper balance between academic freedom and independence on the other, and social responsibility on the other. So academic freedom and responsibility and societal responsibility should be put into a balance. So I don't think I have to explain how different this is from the previous conception. And also note that when it comes to social responsibility, this report is not about dual use, it's not about law breaking, it's not about discrimination. This is really about about essentially contested concepts, basically, people, environment, plant. And as we heard before, we can have a lot of discussions about what culture is, we can have a lot of discussions about what environment is, what is good for people, etc., etc. We live in a pluriform world, so what are we bringing into the purpose of science here? And basically, if this is a very old concept of science as the handmaiden of religion or ideology or whatever. It's a very classic image of philosophy having to serve religious purposes, etc. And the question is, where does science stand here? Is science still an autonomous institution, or is it now also serving other purposes? How do we go about that? So, must science serve for example, social change or have societal impact. What do we mean by societal impact? Who knows what right societal impact is? Who knows what social change is the right change and what is it? I'm only clarifying my question to you. So of course, I think many of you were in Cape Town with Cape Town statement in 2022. And if you were there, you also know that this was a matter of discussion. Should, for example, D&I be part of the research culture? Should it be on the same footing as independence, impartiality, objectivity, or whatever? And there the conclusion was more or less that it was very important for research. It was a condition of doing good research that unconscious bias should be made conscious, etc., that there was that there were inequalities underlying research, but within that framework. So there's good research, but you have to also look at the conditions of research. There may be inequalities, so we must face them, but it's not necessarily on the same footing as the other core values of science. Now the ALEA Code, the European Code, they took this a step further, and there you see that these external purposes are more ingrained in the core values of science. So they, in the revised edition, say that the European Code of Conduct for Research Science describes professional, legal, societal, ethical, and moral responsibilities of the different actors and settings within the academia. So this is a very big concept of research integrity. Effective code of conduct for the research community promotes an ethical mindset. So, ethical mindset seems to imply more than just looking at the baseline of research integrity. And with core value of accountability, it says that for the accountability for the research from idea to publication, for its management, organization, training, supervision, mentoring, and for its wider societal impacts. And you know, many researchers, when you go for funding nowadays, we also heard it in the earlier talk, for example, in the Dutch Research Council, you have to say, well, what is the expected result of your research? And then there's a new bracket, and then you say, what is the societal impact of that expected result? And what does that mean for you as a scientist? So we're clearly leaving the idea of Popper that also if you falsify another theory, then you're doing good research and it's progress in the academia. That thought is now far away. The research environment should promote values such as equity, diversity, inclusion, but more they should trainings in ethics, etc. And research protocols should take account and are sensitive to basically anything. And I think here we fall more into the category of the Cape Town statement, so make sure that we don't have any blind spots. But this to round this off with reviewing and assessment, and here I think we come back more to the core of science. It says that researchers, research institutions and organizations should adopt assessment practices that are based on principles of quality, okay, knowledge, advancement, and impact that go beyond quantitative indications and take into account diversity, inclusiveness, openness, and collaboration where relevant. So I think that means a lot that we as academics should assess other academics and their work, academic work, also by these standards. Now, and so to round off my question to you, what tensions does this give? First, what is societal change? Who decides on what societal change is? Or social justice, and to stay close to my own university, University of Amsterdam, in our gender department, we have had very fierce discussions between classic feminists on the one hand and transgenders on the other, who both saying, okay, what is the right research culture? Do we allow room for this concept or not? Should that be funded, etc., etc. That was typical for Amsterdam. This discussion was also all over the newspapers, etc. Whose ethics? Whose morality? And what are we content as scientists that science would serve other purposes, or do we want to retain our grip on what the purposes of science? What are the implications for funding, promotions, appointments? And this is from my experience in Research Integrity Committee, what does this mean for misconduct? When it comes to, for example, somebody saying, well, I did not feel safe around that person. Or when somebody draws this scientific conclusion, I think it's at odds with principles of people, environment, etc., etc. Should that person then be eligible for scientific misconduct? And what we see of course, for the Amsterdam, again to stay with my own university, the Israel-Hamas war is sparking a lot of debates about all these concepts, about safe spaces, about with which external parties should you deal with or not, and how do other people feel about that, both from within Jewish group, within university, as within the group that are vehemently opposed to any type of collaboration. And in the US, we see in some universities, some top universities now, a kind of reverse direction where D&I, for example, are where there's less emphasis on D&I and also less emphasis on okay, we're going to kind of qualify which external parties you can work with and which is not, as long as we guarantee that the academics can do their work. For example, when it comes to fossil fuel, Princeton has just reversed their policy. So we also see a kind of a reverse direction. And to close it up, I'm just very curious as to where you stand. Thank you.
Well, not a question. Well, perhaps, I'm not sure. But you ask for points of view. So I've worked in Berlin for 6 years in Germany. And in Germany since 1989, 1990, Article 5 says that the arts and sciences are free. In fact, it's the free speech article. It's the same article that says the Vrijheid van Meinung, Kunst und Wissenschaften. And that being said, it's interesting that the Netherlands doesn't have that, having a very old constitution that allows us to stretch that idea of academic freedom. And when I teach this workshop on scientific conduct, we also do academic freedom a little bit, because Bentley Glass said that one of the things about good science is also to defend the freedom for intellectual investigation, perhaps even with one's life. That's a bit much for our situation, but we always come to the conclusion that perhaps there is a academic freedom in the sense of a right, but in terms of where resources go, it has to be informed by society. So sure, there's the freedom to do whatever you want, but the money just goes towards that direction. And that is then where we end, because we don't know where the boundary is of giving no funds at all. So that is how we always have this in our workshop. Is that a thing that this was discussed also in terms of Germany, etc., in the working groups that you've been part of? Well,
the point you raise, I think, is very, very interesting, because part of the problem here, and there was also the Zon&Wee research into academic freedom, and what a lot of academics apparently said, or it showed from the research, is they said, well, now that the funding is so concentrated and much of the monies are coming either from Europe or through the Dutch Research Council, then you are kind of forced to, either though we are free on an individual level, our academic freedom is not, or is restrained by what we can get funding for. And one of the results of that was, well, maybe you should kind of loosen the funding criteria a little bit and give individual academics or individual faculties more say in what they want funding for. But yeah. And our constitution is maybe too old.
Yeah. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you for your overview and your comparison of the different codes that we have. I think for the questions you ask here, you have forgotten one of the cornerstones for all these moral things. That's the research ethics. So we have a much longer tradition of research ethics at the universities. And most of that we take for granted. So we take for granted that we cannot do research on prisoners anymore because they're just there, and it's which was a nice possibility for researchers, that these prisoners were available and you could do anything with that. Same for animals. You could for a long time we could do anything with animals. For a long time in the social sciences we did not have to care about research ethics because, well, these people could talk back. These times we also have to be responsible for what we do with our interviews and surveys, etc. I raised that because if you look at the history of this research ethics, all these new steps have gone with the situation: is this affecting academic freedom? Yeah. Is this affecting scientific misconduct? And we have accepted that there are limitations to what we can do as researchers. Also in the natural sciences, there are laboratory safeties. We're not allowed to do any radioactive experiments with students, etc. And we're all not allowed to do that anymore. It really harms the development of knowledge, but for good reasons. And I would say that some of the issues you raise now, and I see that as a new step in towards defining what is the responsibility. And that's my second remark, is that you have formulated it very much as an individual issue. And I think that we here, well, see also this a challenge with the promises that as organizations or as community make towards society, that we will act responsibility and solve problems, and that and these calls for fossil fuel research, stop funding, etc., are a response to that from our colleagues, and say, if we promise to solve the climate problem, then we cannot work with these companies. Then if we promise that we solve social cohesion, then we should do research and also be and that's my interpretation of your question to us. What social change, whose ethics, whose morality, etc. It's our social change, it's our morality, and we have to deal with that as a community of scientists, rethinking our responsibilities. And then you need this third corner of ethics, but also not see it as an individual issue, but as a community issue.
Yeah, good point. I'm very grateful for this input, because the funding, also the systemic side of funding, and of course these kind of baselines that we have, that we accept, and how high can you go? These are I think the key questions. Maybe a question in reverse, because I did exclude dual use and discrimination and so on, and yes, there were big debates about, does it infringe academic freedom and so on. And so there is a moral idea within the community, and I think you have to be very careful when do you accept more infringement. But we now live in a time that a lot of issues are being moralized, and that the scientific community can be very polarized also within itself. And I think that there's the danger that the scientific community does not become a kind of community in itself that is completely estranged from what society is thinking, and thereby we lose trust. And for example, one of the discussions that I participated in was a researcher from Florida, where they said, well, it is not good for society if we will go on with gender research. Therefore, we should stop gender research in the state of Florida. So here you have an idea of moral and societal goods that was, so it's,
it's really interesting, and it's true. And in former days, so if you look at dual use is really interesting here, and in terms of how that's been organized organizationally. So there's a lot of countries where in universities say we're not doing military research. And that's not because there's not no military research being done in that country, but that's being excluded from the university. It's put in specific research institutes where they can maintain all the kinds of rules and regulations, etc., and can ignore the morality of that, which you cannot within a university. So in the Netherlands, we're doing that at TNO, and we're doing that at the DLE, etc., and which we for a long time have not seen as scientific institutes.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing is that now we have included them in the code of conduct, and sometimes the RIVM at the COVID, we suddenly saw it as a scientific institute. Yeah. For a long time, we didn't saw that. And so what we see is that universities do not want to exclude these things anymore because of the money, because of the reputation, because of their, and so they have to redefine it that well. And maybe indeed some of the research we don't do anymore, we have to put again not in the university but in other institutes.
Yeah. Well, or is it a form of hypocrisy that we introduce? Yeah.
Thank you very much for all your questions addressed to us and for walking us through the code and the sort of change that we're also seeing there in a national perception, maybe at least. Something I was wondering about is also, especially in the landscape of all of this, I've noted that there's a tendency of our most critical thinkers to sometimes almost step away from science because they feel that in particular if their ideas are a little bit controversial. I've heard many stories of people who published on controversial topics. So Francesca Minerva, who wrote on afterbirth abortion, people like Peter Singer, who've also become critical towards maybe the article from Folia and the sort of university as an institution in not really allowing that much academic freedom anymore. And I've seen them form their own new niche journals of controversia. And I'm wondering, is that the future you think we're looking at, where it's going to be more and more and more siloed? And how do we get back to a university where we're also okay with being confronted with views that are fundamentally different from our own?
Yeah, very good question, thanks. Now, I was talking during the break with Serge that, and Serge said, well, actually the academia is late to the party when it comes to integrity and regulation, etc., etc. And my take on that would be rightly so. And perhaps we should not even be in the party. Because I think the academia is one of the least regulated professions in the world. And there's a good reason for that. And that is because there should be this urge towards innovation and towards being critical. And that means that you step outside of the boundaries that you are taught. And I think that for that reason, it's very important not to have too much restrictions, both substantive or procedural, on science. That said, there is of course a reputation risk, there is the societal trust, and there are these core elements that should never be violated. And I think that also having been a member of scientific integrity committees for 15 years, we're still trying to find the right balance and the right approach to that.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for raising all these interesting thoughts and thank you.
Thank you, yeah.